I was a cooperating witness in what became the largest insider trading investigation in U.S. history. You really figure out who your true friends are. Most people drop ties. Tom Hardin is this guy, Tipper X, this major Wall Street informant. I'm not going to ever talk to him again. And not that they did anything wrong, just because of the stigma of being connected with me.
If you don't understand what your core values are, then you're susceptible to make any number of slippery slope decisions. But that when you have that set of core values and you go back to them on a regular basis, it's a good antidote from sliding down the slippery slope.
I remember to this day, Wanda, like 4 texts I got from friends from college who said they saw what happened. And they weren't saying, poor Tom. They were saying, hey, you really messed up big time. What are you going to do about this now, Tom? You're still young. You have the opportunity to do something about this to make it right. Anybody who's listening, who's done something they're ashamed of, again, something you're carrying, the secret is heavier than the disclosure. I'm not saying go on a podcast like this. I'm saying just tell one person.
If you could wind back the clock and consult with your younger self, what would you wish you had done in advance or been prepared for?
I wish I had actually been more.
There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone.
Welcome to the conversation. Okay, you know the phenomena. Sometimes the choices you make work out brilliantly for you, for the quote, greater good, unquote. And sometimes the choices you make don't work out quite so well. Sometimes those choices are a slippery slope that puts you in a place you didn't want it to be, forcing you to make even more choices that maybe you never expected. Now, it could happen to absolutely any one of us, including me. The question is, when you find yourself in that place, how do you react? What do you do to bounce back? Is there a bounce back from a tough situation like that? How do you muster the courage to actually talk about it publicly? Well, today we're in for a story of somebody who has been there, and we hope we don't have to repeat in his shoes, but I think the lessons, the insights are incredibly powerful. So my guest today is Tom Hardin. Tom helps organizations identify and close the blind spots that quietly push good people towards bad decisions. He's the founder of Tipper X Advisors. He works with a lot of Fortune Global 500 companies, boards of directors, and a whole lot of others. What sets Tom apart is the combination of candid firsthand storytelling, as you're going to hear right here, and then his own lived experiences and pressures with ambition, with competition, with incentives from the inside. And he's going to talk about how that actually came around to erode some of his judgment, and then what he did as a result, and what the insights are on the back of that. The book, in case you want to read it, is Wired on Wall Street. So, Tom, welcome to the conversation.
It's a pleasure to be here, Wanda. Thank you for having me.
I'm delighted, because how many times do we get to talk about this? We talk about it in abstract, but we don't really talk about it in practice. So we're going to talk about it in practice. So you got to tell me now the brief story. You found yourself in an uncomfortable situation. What happened? Just tell us the story.
Sure. So the short version is I grew up in the Atlanta suburbs, went to Wharton at UPenn. I was a good student, started on Wall Street about 25 years ago. I was working at a small technology stock-focused hedge fund in 2007, where I was 29 years old, a junior partner. And over about a 9-month stretch, Wanda, I placed 4 trades on inside information that came to me from a woman in my network. The trades made my firm about $1.2 million, and my personal share was around $46,000. The FBI stopped me on the street in July of 2008 and confronted me about those trades in a summer morning. And by the end of that conversation, I was a cooperating witness in what became the largest insider trading investigation in U.S. history. Over 81 people were arrested, 32 cooperators. Wanda, I would learn later, I was the youngest person of the 81 charged, and my $46,000 was the least amount of money made of anybody. And for 2 years, I wore a wire. They eventually called me Tipper X. I helped them build 20 of these 81 cases. The judge gave me time served, no prison sentence, but the felony conviction stays, and my career ended. And for years after that, I was a stay-at-home dad in New Jersey trying to figure out what to do next. And what grew out of that was an opportunity to speak at the FBI. They invited me, and that's turned into what I do now, trying to help companies, boards, business schools to learn about how people drift into bad decisions, and not because I'm a hero, just because I happen to live every stage of it, and I've spent the last decade trying to understand why.
So 2 years you're wearing a wire and basically spying on your coworkers, 81 of whom are going to get end up getting convicted or charged, I should say.
Yes, and I had actually an open playing field where the woman who had tipped me on the stocks had worn a wire on me. And so the FBI said, who are the worst actors out there in the industry? So I actually had to build relationships with people over 2 years who I didn't know that well and get them into conversations about, times they had broken laws. So it's a lot easier said than to actually execute that. But I got good at it over 2 years where I'd ask the target a question and then say nothing. And then they'd eventually, after about 3 meetings with me, they would fill in the silence and talk about contacts they had, giving them information.
Wow. I cannot imagine being in that situation. So, first, you're trapped because the person giving you insider information is already working with the FBI. We never know when that's happening or not happening or going to happen after the fact. And then 2 years with feeling like, in some ways, you have a gun to your head because otherwise, as bad as it is, you're looking at prison time.
Yep. It was a very stressful moment, and it's 2008, so the financial crisis is in full throttle, and it was really as I wrote the book, I just said, how did I even get through all this? It was really stressful.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, other than necessity, is there anything that encouraged you to go cooperate with the FBI? I get that they're holding a metaphorical gun to your head, but was there something else that's going on there?
Well, and I think what even led up to the point to make those decisions, which is what I talk about today, because the easy answer was pressure. I was under pressure to perform, and we had lost money in our first quarter of investing in our hedge fund for our investors. And my boss came into my office and said something I quote now in every talk, Tom, we're investing over a 3-year horizon, but we just lost money in the first quarter. Now we have to start looking for shorter term opportunities to make money every month. So the goals went from 3 years to monthly in that conversation. And the time, horizon collapsed into 30 days. And I already had latitude to buy a small position in our stock portfolio and not have to talk to my boss, like on a new idea I'm working on. And suddenly that meant something very different. So I went from a junior analyst with, a patient capital looking at 3 years to a junior analyst trying to find monthly performance alone at my desk.
Well, and that would encourage some crazy behavior from anybody. Like you've got to take some risks in order to succeed day in and day out on that one. All right. When you got the insider information, how did you feel about it? Did you feel like this is the wrong thing to do? I mean, what was your thinking process at the time?
Yeah, when she called me, it was a gradual, classic slippery slope where it sounded like an explicit stock tip about a public company was going to be acquired by a private equity firm. So I think anybody listening, even if you don't work in the markets, you would understand that this was an inside tip. It's not public, and so I didn't make any trades that day, Wanda, but I did share it with a friend who was at a trading firm where he was losing money, and he told me, we were catching up, and he's looking for shorter term opportunities. He has to make money, to get back into the green. And I said, hey, I'm not doing this, but if you want to, this woman just told me this, is happening in a few weeks. Here's the date. Here's the price. And just pausing right there, especially if anybody listening who has this privileged information at a company, by sharing it, even though I didn't trade yet, I have now exposed myself to being charged with insider trading just for tipping this information. There was actually a group of 30 lawyers charged in May of 2026, just a few weeks ago, for tipping client information like this. He buys it. He tells this whole firm. They load up. He calls me back and he says, dude, are you in? And as I mentioned, I could buy a stock in our portfolio and not have to talk to my boss as long as it was less than 1% of the money we manage for clients. I remember calculating and buying a 0.9% position in our portfolio in Kronos. And I thought if my boss had a problem with this trade, he would ask me, why are you doing this? My boss never said anything. The deal happened. The stock's up 40%. And Wanda, I thought I might be fired when it happened. Like, oh my gosh, I clearly broke the law. I go into our morning meeting and he says, oh, it's one of those, keep me out of it.
Ooh, okay. So there's a lot of this going around. I think I believe is happening. It's why the FBI is investigating. Okay, relationships with peers, like do they come back? I mean, like, have you permanently burned those bridges with people? What's the state of affairs there?
So it's a real mixed bag. Once my name became public, I think people were scared that knew me. Like, oh my gosh, was I trading any of these stocks? Did Tom wear a wire on me? But I actually protected two friends that the FBI was looking at just by, I felt through my cooperation, I should bring them who I felt are the worst actors in the industry, and that's what I focused on. And I was able to protect two friends who were never charged. I hope they see themselves in the book. Of course, I changed their names. I realized that I was trying to protect them, but you really figure out who your true friends are. Most people drop ties. Tom Hardin is this guy, Tipper X, this major Wall Street informant. I'm not gonna ever talk to him again. And not that they did anything wrong, just because of the stigma of being connected with me. But you really figure out who your true friends are. And I remember to this day, Wanda, like 4 texts I got from friends from college who said they saw what happened, and they weren't saying poor Tom. They were saying, "Hey, you really messed up big time. What are you going to do about this now, Tom? You're still young. You have the opportunity to do something about this to make it right." So they really held my feet to the fire because my wife stayed with me through all this, which 85% of marriages end, and she was willing to stay with me if I could figure it out. So I had four good friends reach out and hold my feet to the fire and said, "Look, you have to figure this out. You have to, figure out how you're gonna get back from this."
Good for that. Boy, don't we all need friends like that who say, yeah,
Yes,
it happened,
yes,
but next, what's next? And a partner as well who does the same.
yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk for this moment about a slippery slope. Clayton Christensen and Karen Dillon have written about this. Richard Shell has written about this. Everybody's been a podcast guest at some point in time on this show where they talk about watching people make a decision that was an edgy decision. And then they make another decision and another decision. And sort of 5 years later, you find yourself in a position that you never would have agreed to, but you've just inched towards something. You feel a little bit about that with this scenario. So, walk me through how you see this as a slippery slope.
Yeah, for my own situation, the woman who I mentioned, she called me with the information. I didn't make any trades, but I shared it with my friend. So my first step across the line was sharing it with a friend. But I felt, I'm not trading it. I'm still a good person. So I think a lot of this time, the first step across the line is we still think of ourselves as a good person. Or I know, Christensen used to talk about just this once, when he taught to his
Yeah.
class. If you say just this once, that's a warning flag. And so I told myself, I'll share it with him. And then he calls me back, they're all in. And I told myself, okay, I'll do it just this one time. And of course, it's never just this once. It would happen three more times with my boss looking the other way, her calling me. And then by the third trade, Wanda, she's actually asking me for a cash payoff for her source of information because I was wondering, why is she giving this information? It's not benefiting her. She's helping me. And she says, Tom, if this is going to continue, her source in California wants $15,000 for this information. So I'm actually going through the airport at one point to carry that to her. So it went from helping out her friend, I told myself, to carrying cash to an airport. And that's the classic slope where you look up and you didn't ever expect you'd be there, in that
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah. And then we go on from there forward. Okay. Incredible story. And I think incredible lessons. Let's talk about the courage at level one to say, yes, I'm going to wear a wire, and yes, I'm going to help root out some of the worst actors, some of whom are my colleagues and maybe have been mentors for me. Let's talk about the courage to come back to your family and say, this is what's happening, and I'm going to need your support. Let's talk about the courage also to say, what am I doing next and where am I going with my life? And to write a book about it, for goodness sake. So, how do you see your own level of courage and what helped you increase your courage?
I'm sometimes uncomfortable with the word courage because I just felt like I just did what I felt was the best decision in the moment. Like after the trades happened, I can't trade that. So the FBI approaches me on the street. They told me not to talk to a lawyer, Wanda, which they're not supposed to say, but I didn't. I didn't talk to a lawyer for 2 years, and so I felt, you know what, my best decision here is probably to help them, build cases against the worst actors. And then they invite me to speak, and so for 9 years I'm speaking, and now the book is out. I was not even sure I wanted to speak the first time they invited me, 9 years ago, because I was certain it would be humiliating. But I went on my first podcast about 10 years ago, and a bunch of people reached out that were touched by it. I got hundreds of messages from people who saw themselves in the story, and they weren't criminals. These were students, these were parents, these were people living some kind of double life maybe. And so by the time I wrote the book, I'd been telling this story for years. And the harder question was always whether to put it down on paper, as I have, in a form that my kids could read. And so I mentioned my wife stayed with me, and she made the whole book possible. And she didn't really encourage me to write it. She did, but more than encouraging me, she lived through every chapter and was willing to let me put it on the page, honestly. And so she's actually in the book. She's a big part of it. She came on stage last year at one of my speaking events where I had the opportunity to talk to her, and people in the audience asked her, "How'd you get through the bad times?" And she said, "Well, we had tough times, but we never had bad times because we never turned against each other." And again, 85% of marriages end in this situation. So I always say I made 4 bad choices on these trades. I made one incredibly good decision early in my life. And what I tell anybody who's thinking about telling a hard story publicly like this, and I get the question a lot, especially with the books out. And again, you don't have to do anything criminal. Maybe something you've been hiding is that I think the secrecy is heavier than the disclosure by a lot. And every speaking engagement I do is lighter than the year before the story came out, when only my wife and the FBI knew.
Right. I agree with you. That holding on to something almost feels like it eats you alive from the center out, and that it's easier to tell it. And I think you also find, as you found, not everybody is going to be your friend afterwards, but there are an awful lot of people who then reach out in remarkable ways, and they're probably the ones that count the most. And if not, maybe better to find out sooner rather than later.
That's right.
Let's talk about this notion of resilience. We always say, how do you bounce back from an event like that? I'm presuming there is no bounce back because you're not going back to the financial services industry or back to where you were or any capacity. So, what have you learned about resilience?
And thanks for asking it that way, because that distinction is the whole thing. There's no back, and the word bouncing is, I think, the most misleading word we use about this. And the picture people have of resilience is like a basketball. You hit the ground, you snap up, you keep moving. And that was not my experience, and isn't the experience of many people. The image I offer instead is masonry, where you lay one honest brick at a time, and you don't get to see the wall for a long time. And most days, you're not even sure you're building anything. You're just placing the next brick. So I definitely didn't bounce back. I rebuilt slowly. And those are different verbs, and the difference matters, because if you're sitting in your version of this and you think bouncing is the standard, you're going to feel like you're failing at recovery on top of everything else. And so for a long time, the goal in my head was to bounce, to get back to where I was, same income level, same sense of self, and that wasn't going to happen. And the other thing that surprised me about this is, and I'd put this in front of anybody listening who's in their own version of this, is that service came before finding my purpose and not after it. And so I started volunteering at our church on weeknights, helping pack groceries for families I'd never met. And the guy that ran the program at church didn't say, "Oh my gosh, it's Tipper X, everyone." He just said, "Hey, here's a clipboard. Can you help out?" And, that was the first time in years that somebody treated me as useful instead of just a story. And the speaking work, the book, all that came years later, but the bricks came first. And the last piece, and it might sound semantic, but it's not, is the difference between guilt and shame. Like, guilt says, I did a bad thing. Shame says, I'm an awful person who did a bad thing. And shame isolates you. Guilt for me, it reconnects me because it gives me something to repair. And I spent about 10 years stuck in shame before I figured that out. So resilience for me, it's not really a personality trait. It's a series of honest choices made after everything fell apart, one brick at a time. And honestly, today, some days I do it well and some days I don't.
I love that. Bounce back. You're right. When you think about the metaphor of that, the meaning of that is I hit one bounce and everything is a okay. It's like I make one move and voila, life is as it was before. And everything I've ever seen about people facing whatever kind of crisis has come in their lives by their own doing or by not their own doing, it's not that fast and it's not one choice. And they all say you make one decision today that puts you in a slightly better place tomorrow or a slightly different place tomorrow, and you make a different decision tomorrow and another decision and another decision. And I'm talking about all the work that was done around natural disasters and surviving those, as well as people who wake up from things like the Boston Marathon bombing, who were in the prime of their life and now have lost both legs and maybe more. And that, there is no back and there is no immediate, and it is one small step at a time.
The one thing that helped me was the Stoic tenet of just focusing on what I could control. Like I read so many self-help books that didn't help me because it made me think about myself. And so I would say that that's one tenet that some of the books that the Stoics wrote and Ryan Holiday's work about just focusing on what you can control really helped me focus.
That's really important. Were there people who were really particularly helpful for you in this journey?
Yeah, there was a guy, as I mentioned, when I went to start volunteering at my church. Greg Ryan, he's a retired plumber. He ran the Human Concerns Committee. He was helpful for me as I got to really opening up to him with my story about just sort of like help us out, be of service. You're going to feel a lot better once you have some perspective about my life circumstance and my own choices and see what other people are going through. So he was sort of my Yoda in a sense, this sort of
Yeah.
retired plumber, wonderful man. And then my wife was just amazing. Again, just be the best stay-at-home dad you can be. But we decided to go along with our family plan during this process, and so I'm very grateful that I had the years as a stay-at-home parent, and my girls when they're younger. I had to care for them as the stay-at-home dad, and so that just sort of consumes any stay-at-home parent. Well, no, that's all consuming. That's a real job, but they did it in a way they sort of saved me, I think, from thinking about myself because I had to service their needs. And so then there's just people that came out that really helped me get going on the speaking circuit after I spoke at the FBI. There's just true champions of getting my message out there. So again, you do really, I don't recommend going through something like this, but you do figure out who your true friends are, as we were saying earlier, when you go through something like this.
I think you just point out the second tenet we know about people surviving major disasters is that you have to reach out pretty broadly. That the immediate people right around you, you probably already know what they think, and they're not going to offer you a radically new idea. And they're also there to kind of say, "Come on, you can do it." What you need are ideas, and you don't get those ideas by staying in your current bubble. You got to expand out. Like with Greg, for you, where you see the power of service and what that does for you, or like the FBI in a weird way, reaching out and saying, "Hey, would you come talk?" Or friends who are saying, "Help me help you build a speaking business," something I'm certain you never imagined you were going to do at the start of all of this one.
And I wish I reached out to people sooner, Wanda. I went through years of this shame versus guilt, a lot of shame. And I wish I had reached out to people sooner to help me sort of figure out, strategize how to get back on my feet and lay these bricks and figure out what the next stage is. And for me too, like you have to accept responsibility. So as the years went by, sometimes I'd look at a case and there'd be a company that just pays a fine for clear felonies they were committing and nobody's charged. And I thought, well, this is so much worse than mine. And my wife would say, "Hey, is that helping you, Tom, find a job?" So she really held my feet to the
Right.
fire. Look, this is just the way life is. And you have to be able to forgive yourself. And that's probably the hardest thing to do, especially if anybody's going through something self-inflicted where your own actions, your own decisions impacted your family, your loved ones, your community. You have to be able to have some perspective, forgive yourself, and learn from it.
Yeah. Let's talk about that one for a little bit. And this shame versus guilt is a big one. I will come back to that in a minute. But just staying with that notion of forgiving yourself. So I said to you before we started recording today that I had given a talk, and one of the questions coming from one of the audience members was, in effect, how do I forgive myself if I think I've made a small mistake in that case, or I'm not at my best, or I've got a thing that I'm not really good at, or, it's been a bad, rough period. How do I talk myself into feeling good about me? What's your advice in that case?
And I think it comes back to, again, not keep harping on it, but the shame and guilt. Like whatever the act is, whatever the mistake is. One thing that was helpful for me, I wrote in the book, is I told myself I made mistakes and it made me feel better, whereas I actually made bad decisions. And if we call our bad decisions mistakes, we're not really owning our bad decisions. So I would encourage people to think about, was it a mistake? Was it a bad decision? Because how you deal with either, and we make both, is important in terms of how you are able to move to move forward. So that was one big unlock for me: mistakes versus bad decisions, and then the guilt versus the shame, where I'm not the mistake, I'm not the bad decision. That's not me as a person. That's my action, but I have the opportunity to look forward in the windshield. I talk in some of my talks about having a windshield mentality, where you just look forward, and again, you try to make the best decisions you can today. Going back to your earlier point about breaking it down into small sort of micro habits, the book Atomic Habits talks about this, where just focusing on the next decisions you can make, and not sort of putting your own sense of self around, the past mistakes, the past bad decisions. Hopefully you've learned from those, and it's important to learn from those, but just focusing on the windshield going forward.
I like that. I like a couple of things that you've said here. One is this notion that I am not necessarily what I did. I may have done a whole range of things, but that doesn't define who I am. And I think we get caught up in whatever mistake, error, bad decision, as if that colors entirely all of me, becomes part of my brand. I don't think it has to. So there's something that went wrong. That doesn't define who I am and what I'm about. So that was point one.
Our past can't define us without our consent. So that's the most important thing, maybe, too.
That is important. I always say the past is a part of you. What you do with it
Yeah.
in the present is a very different scenario. So, same idea. The second point you made is saying that it was a mistake when it was actually a bad decision. That's an important distinction because you're owning your action in it. Stuff goes wrong, mistakes happen. Yes, not everything that went wrong is a bad decision, but when it was a bad decision, a wrong decision, an appropriate decision, it's important to acknowledge it because that's the part you learn from, as opposed to the decision that went awry. And if we didn't, we're in the same situation again, we do the exact same thing because that's,
Right.
yeah. Okay. All right. Let's talk for a minute about the guilt versus the shame. We've been kind of talking around it a bit. So, guilt is, I feel, you said, feel bad
Yeah.
about what I've done. I regret, and I can repair that. Shame is, I feel bad about me. There's something about me. So, part of what we've been saying is to separate the actions and the decisions from you as a person and from your personality. Have any more advice or any more experiences on what helps separate those two?
Shame isolates you. I almost on purpose isolated myself for years and didn't reach out to people that I should have, as you mentioned, is an important step. And so if you're isolated, you're not reaching out, you're going through a shame spiral. And guilt for me, maybe weirdly, sort of reconnects me because it gives me something to repair. And so I'm always thinking about my talk and the insights and how does that continue to evolve over the years. And so I think for me, and it may not be true, I don't want to generalize for everyone, but for me, there's almost like a form of healthy guilt where it's an ember that's sort of always burning a little bit that helps me now go out and talk to the next generation. The next generation now behind me is starting their careers or they're in college. And to share this, and in terms of that guilt, that little flickering ember sort of keeps me going. But it's important that I can be honest with myself. And am I feeling shame? And if I am, maybe I should stop, or take a pause sharing this story and sort that out with myself. But really, I think shame, you lose it when you can forgive yourself. And again, it's just so important for people that your past, your mistakes, your bad decisions, they cannot define who you are without your consent. Like if they're defining how you're letting it do that. So don't give them the consent to be able to do that. And maybe easier for me to say than done. And I've never talked to a therapist or a doctor about this, really just my wife and my priest and just sort of these people in my life. But that's how I thought through it.
Yeah. Brene Brown has several very old, lovely TED Talks on exactly this. If somebody wants another version of all of this, the guilt versus the shame. And she'll say the same thing as you is that the shame makes you feel horrible about yourself as a person, like I'm not worthy as a person. Whereas guilt is, I regret something I have done. Um, and I can do something about it. And you're right, I think most of the time, when you tell people something about the shame, it's remarkable how much other people then open up or support or
Yeah.
can recognize themselves in that story as well.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's right.
I'm going to shift gears one more time to talk about values. Right. So Leadership values as a leader used to be a thing we talked about 20, 30 years ago when we quit, probably closer to 30. It stopped being popular. And it is back on the radar for sure. And I think in a better way, in a more meaningful way. And I happen to believe that if you don't understand what your core values are, then you're susceptible to making a number of slippery slope decisions because somebody said, "Hey, are you with us?" Or "Why not? I'm there." Or "My friends are doing it, so why not?" My boss is asking for it. There's a whole sorts of excuses you can give yourself, but that when you have that set of core values and you go back to them on a regular basis, it's a good antidote from sliding down the slippery slope. That's my view. I'm interested in your view, Tom.
I think there's a couple things with that. I hadn't certainly done the work, but I'm not sure values work alone would have changed what I did, which is kind of an uncomfortable thing for me to say. If you would have asked me before my first stock tip if I had values, I would have said, "Oh yes, I stand for honesty and family and work ethic, and I'm not the guy who would cut corners, and I would mean every word." So the problem, I had perception of values. The problem is that my values or what we do with them. In my office, we had words on a poster. There was a line in the code of conduct. It didn't survive contact with the moment, and the moment was fast. The moment was 90 seconds. The moment was me placing a trade order in the stock, and the moment was a euphemism that let me avoid putting my values up against what I was about to do. And so I think the deeper version of the question though is whether I'd done the work to know what I actually wanted my life to be about, and that's something I hadn't, and that might have changed the outcome. And I wanted to be in the end group of my industry, and the end group in my industry were the people getting this information, and that was my operating motive, even if I'd never have phrased it that way out loud. So the end group of those conferences was trading on the information, and my real values in the moment were closer to belong than to anything else on the poster. And I think the framing, that the phrases and sentences you actually live by would have helped me if I would have done the work honestly, and not as an exercise, but as something I sat with until I knew which way I'd lean when nobody was watching. And most people, including me in my 20s, skip that step because it's harder than writing down integrity. And so I think the companies that I work with today who do this well, they have one or two phrases that act like sort of circuit breakers. And when the pressure hits a certain level, the phrase fires and the decision changes. And that's what I'd want my younger self to have built. And I unfortunately did not.
I think Robert Glazer, who's also been, the book is called The Compass Within. He's also been a podcast guest, and he talks about this, that it's too easy for the words to not have meaning. That until you've actually turned it into your own phrasing and you're willing to look at those values daily and kind of, well, not daily, but regularly, and say, would I use them to make a hard decision? And can I evaluate myself on this meeting, on this year's performance against those? Until you're willing to do that, you've not got something that's really solid. But you also make an important point, Tom, which is the decisions that got you in deeper water were momentary, where, come on, you're a part of us, you want to belong, as you rightly said, and it's seconds. Do or don't do. First off, you're trying to help out a friend. So out of generosity in some ways. And second is like, are you in or not? And it's seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how many of us would have gone back to our values at that moment in time.
And it's so important, I think, when I talk to companies today, and especially I just keep thinking about the next generation where they don't even know what they don't know, and everybody hopefully wants to do the right thing, but you have to kind of pre-rehearse in your mind, okay, the pressure will be there at one point in my career. There will be a temptation to go left or right, and the rationalizations will be in my head, or my boss might be looking at the other way. And what will I do in the moment so that you're not deciding in the moment? You're not rationalizing, maybe
Right.
I'm in the in group, I want to belong. Like, what you're going to do in the moment because you prepared for it. So that muscle memory is really important. But it's important also that you can work at a company where it's psychologically safe to talk about these things.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some companies do it better than others.
Right. Right. Well, and you did mention things to your boss, but your boss said, I don't want to know about that.
That's right.
That didn't help very much either. So,
Not
so
a good,
much
not a
for
good
that one.
mentor of us. Exactly.
Okay. If you could wind back the clock to your younger self And perhaps you don't want to do that either because you're having a great life now and you're doing a lot and a lot of wonderful things and making contributions. And maybe you're where you're supposed to be or want to be. But if you could wind back the clock and consult with your younger self at that moment that you tell the friend about this information and then that you respond to the phone call and say, yes, I'm in. What would you wish you had done in advance or been prepared for?
I wish I had actually been more thoughtful in seeking out mentors in my 20s. My boss, as you mentioned, wasn't a great boss looking the other way, being willfully blind. He was the closest thing, young Tom had to a mentor. And had I been sharing, what I was seeing in my industry, wow, this behavior is pretty rampantly going on. The right mentor, would have slapped young Tom around. Like, why would you ever think about crossing that line? You're already doing so well in your career. It would have been very easy, I think. It was very easy for me to cross that line, stay in my own head. I'm not hurting anybody. I'll play small trades, just this one time. Had I been sharing with what I was seeing with the mentor, it would have been very hard for me to override what they were telling because I'd be letting them down. So I think not making decisions in isolation is a big thing. And also for young Tom, I was drowning in insecurity because my competition, the end group, was cheating to get ahead when I should have just been competing with myself. The world I was in investing is so much like recognizing patterns in markets, and I should have been focused more on competing against myself, improving at the pattern recognition, and not being so worried about what others were doing to get ahead by cheating, because eventually they're going to get caught, and they were.
Interesting. Interesting. All right. If you had an appropriate manager at the time, what would you advise the manager to do?
You have to ask questions about short-term performance. As I was putting up, those four trades were massive short-term performance. And once he got to the root cause of what I was doing, I should have been fired. He should have called the SEC and explained what happened, and not by not asking questions about my performance, by being willfully blind. He almost, in a way, encouraged me to continue to do it by not asking questions.
So asking questions is the secret. But then the problem is once I know that information, I have to do something about it, call the SEC, for example,
That's right.
which is not comfortable either.
Not easy.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Tom, what did we miss? What else do you think people need to know?
For anybody listening who's running an organization, that the behaviors that produced my case weren't unique to me and they weren't unique to Wall Street. Every culture, every company I've engaged with as a speaker has some version of the same architecture, sitting underneath these small drifts we talk about that nobody flags, pressure that compresses time horizons, top performers whose methods nobody examines, and a vocabulary that makes the questionable stuff seem like normal business. So if you're a leader and you want to know whether your firm has a real exposure, don't ask, do we have a code of conduct? Ask what happens to the person who raises a concern. Track them at 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. If their career quietly cools, then you have your answer. Then you have silent retaliation, which is happening, which is going to impact the culture. And the second, I think, on not bouncing back, but on coming back from this, anybody who's listening, who's done something they're ashamed of, against something you're carrying, the secret is heavier than the disclosure. And I'm not saying go on a podcast like this. I'm saying just tell one person. And the version of me who only told my wife was lighter than the version who told no one. And the version of me who told the FBI was lighter than the version who only told my wife. So the version of me telling you on this podcast years later is the lightest version I've ever been. So that's not redemption. I don't think it's just the math of carrying something versus just putting it down.
Yeah, I think, Tom, I mean, you're describing a big event, where the FBI is involved, you're wearing a wire. But I see kind of on a monthly basis people tolerating behavior that actually is really unacceptable. Like a direct report basically telling you an untruth that is not true. It's not major egregious. It's not a big issue. But I look at that and say, wow, what are you encouraging next? And what else are you going to tolerate? And what else is behind it, as opposed to holding people accountable for having been honest? Or being honest and saying, well, that's not what we do around here either. That's okay too. But it's straight
Yeah,
up.
it's so important. I mean, I think people can ask themselves, if I make the decision, if it's not even clear, if I make this decision to go left or right, am I willing to be held accountable for that decision? And I think so many of our codes of conducts have way too many questions the employee is supposed to ask themselves. Just ask yourself that one question.
Sounds pretty good. And in the moment and before in advance, so you're prepared for what you're going to do in that split second of the moment. Tom, what a fascinating story. What a great journey you're on now in terms of helping other people understand how this works and how to avoid being in that scenario. My guest, Tom Hardin, the book Wired on Wall Street. And Tom, if somebody wanted to reach out to you, where's the best place to find you?
So yeah, it's tipperx.com. I just found out the U.S. Patent Office gave me the trademark on tipperx, so there's no more tipperx's out there in the future FBI cases. So all my information is there, and it's Wired on Wall Street, wherever books are sold.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. What a great story. Really appreciate the insights from that one. And to everybody listening, if you want to watch this interview, check out our YouTube channel at Out of the Comfort Pod. Send us a comment. We'd love to hear from you, outofthecomfortzone.com. And otherwise, we'll see you next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone.